You know that instrument in your closet that's been just kind of sitting there for the last like 10, 20 years? You know, when the one that you say that you would go back to and you wanted to play again? Well, today's the day. We're going to be looking at what you can do with those old horns. Stick around. Howdy everybody, my name is Andrew King. We are here at Alamo Music. Don't forget to go to the website alamomusic.com where I have a bunch of items available. Nothing I'm going to be talking about today because today we're going to be talking about old instruments that you might have. Now, this is something that just comes up naturally as being part of a retail store, is people just kind of come by with an old instrument that they've had for a long time. Maybe you played in high school, you did your career, you're retired, and now you have this horn just kind of sitting around you don't know what to do with. Maybe you played in middle school and you just finished high school and you forgot that you did that, so now maybe something nice, you can get something nice, maybe sell the instrument or something like that. Or maybe you just want to get back into it, right? You had this instrument from your parents or maybe your grandparents, and now you have this old vintage instrument, and it might be worth something, or you might want to just play it. There's tons of reasons to be concerned about an old instrument, the horn, and that's kind of just what I want to talk about today. When it comes to old instruments, there's a ton of variations on these that we kind of have to talk about, and I kind of class them in about 3 different ways. You have your vintage stuff, and that's going to be instruments made anywhere from like the 20s to, and this is like realistically what would come in, or you might have an issue with, is like instruments from like the 20s to the 60s, old instruments that have a bunch of like soldered on parts, your kind of old Selmers, your old buffets, your old some Yamahas maybe even mix in there. Instruments that really you don't get parts for or anything, you get those kind of horns. And those could be anywhere from heirlooms, instruments that were really good at the time that were just kind of sitting around for a long time too. And what to do with those is there's kind of a plethora. So I specialize mostly in saxophones for sure, right? And so, but when it comes to any of these kind of instruments, even whether it's a flute, trumpet, trombone, and whatnot, the biggest thing is that you kind of want to get it repaired. When you have these instruments, a lot of the value is going to be placed in its ability to play. Either that or its collectible collection, adjacent nature. But when it comes to those instruments, the ability to play is going to be at the forefront. And so when you're trying to get kind of rid of these instruments or trying to sell those or maybe even put them on a consignment with another store or anything like that, what ends up happening is the repair tech at that place is going to have to put in a lot of work, and I'm talking like 6 to 8 hours of work to get everything working on it. Now, whether it's a flute with a bunch of pads and a lot of bent keys or anything like that that need to be replaced, or it's like a trumpet where the valves just need to get completely replaced and the horns are just completely stuck together and nothing's moving, there's a lot of different things that need to be done to these instruments, and that kind of calls for what's called an overhaul. An overhaul is something that is going to basically go through the entire instrument, clean it completely down, dress it down, and then rebuild it step by step by cleaning each of the parts. Whether it's a saxophone with all the springs, corks, and pads, or it's going to be a trombone where you're going to have to go through the slide and make sure it's completely straightened back out, make sure there's no rust, red rot, or anything like that on the instrument, and then it's just completely cleaned through a sonic bath, a chem clean, or anything above that. And all of that gets done to the instrument. Once that's done and you successfully pay for that work and whatnot, the instrument's going to be ready for anything that you want to do with it. Now, there are going to be some problems with trying to get an instrument like those where it's a super older instrument, maybe even like those older student models, and that's where it's going to be more of a problem to get rid of them. I personally recommend, if you are wanting to get back into playing an instrument and you just have one of those older horns from that period, like the 20s to 60s, I do recommend going in and just buying a newer instrument, a more modern instrument, and there's multiple reasons why. But the biggest reason is that it's just repair parts are way more plentiful with the more modern instruments. While the inherent initial cost up front is going to be more, the problem that kind of comes up is that the older instrument is going to just be more prone to breaking down. If you play an instrument that's that old and it's not been properly taken care of, it's just kind of been in the closet or maybe in the garage or something like that, what ends up happening is the instrument's metal just kind of weakens over time. Whether it's rust, the delacquering, the brass kind of browns over, or maybe even like stuff like the red rot that can get onto it. All of those things, while they can be repaired and cleaned off and presented back, the metal itself has weakened. And so that'll basically be something that you have to watch over for a long time. And the repairs are going to be more frequent, and the repairs themselves are going to be more expensive because they're not as easily repaired. Remember before when I was talking about some of the soldering that's going to be done? Well, a lot of those instruments back then were made primarily with solderers. Nowadays, you have a lot more precision screws, a lot more machine assembly parts that are readily available from manufacturers. So when you get a modern instrument, you know that the repair place is going to have those parts readily available. So unless there's maybe a place around you that has those kind of, antique horn shops, vintage horn shops, whether it's like a specialty shop, like a saxophone shop, or a trumpet shop, or even a flute shop, like that kind of thing. Unless you have one of those, I do recommend just going straight in, maybe using that as a trade-in, or maybe using that as it's just a different opportunity for the item, because getting a more modern instrument is going to help you from there. Now, after that, that's when we get into more stuff from the 70s to the 80s at this point, maybe the 90s, and that's going to be more kind of modern vintage. I'm talking more like your Mark 6s, your Bach Strads. These instruments have not gone through as much of the aging process, and were played during a time when these instruments were super popular in the mainstream, especially with like pop funk bands. So a lot of these instruments came to the country and everything like that, and just were played all the time. So if you had like say something like that back then, these instruments are actually, I would recommend just seeing what the repair would be. Most repair shops are going to give you a free estimate anyways, so it doesn't hurt to check either way, and just to see if it would be worth it. If you have something like an old student model from that time period, I still recommend trying to get something that is a bit more modern if you're sticking with that student model, for the same reasons I would for those really vintage instruments. But for the modern vintage instruments from that time period, if it's like a pro instrument, I personally still use a YAS61 that was made in the early mid-60s. These instruments are still good to go. They just need to be fixed up. And I do recommend, if you can make that initial cost on the repair, usually an overhaul on something like a clarinet, flute is usually like $400, $500. You get into the saxophones, you're getting up there in like the $800, $1,000. Overhauls on trumpets and brass instruments and whatnot usually can be, it's a little different in that case. It's usually like just a chem clean, and then you just go over the instrument from there and replace pads, or like replace corks for keys. For the spit valve and whatnot, and the valve casings. But with that and everything, that's not nearly as much as what it would be on a woodwind. But when you get into that, right, that becomes less of an issue, and those instruments will last a long time. The instruments made during that period were made of really, really good metal. And the other cool thing is that those instruments were made with more modern sensibilities. Not exactly, right? There's going to be some more solder instruments. You got your Selmer Bundys. You got maybe your Bushers, you get into like trumpets and everything, your old Bachs and whatnot, your old Kings. And what ends up happening with those and everything is more along the lines of just, some of the lacquer is going to be stripped off over time, and that might be an issue, but it's not really that bad of a thing. Next, if you get into those more instruments that are from like the 90s to say even the 2010s, those are perfectly fine. Those instruments work out really well. The only thing I recommend is that is when e-commerce started becoming a thing, and that was becoming more prevalent, is that if you have an older instrument from that time period, especially when the Amazon started coming out with a lot of those, started selling a lot of those more easily accessible like Mendinis, Cecilios within the last 10 to 15 years, those I do recommend just getting straight up replaced. Those instruments were not designed to be played more than like 2 or 3 years without being replaced. They don't supply their own repair parts, and it can be an issue getting those fixed up by any like regular repair tech. So I do recommend doing that way. I also recommend on those older instruments, especially on those professional pro modern instruments or the pro vintage ones, definitely look into getting insurance on them as far as that goes through the repair shop or anything like that if they do supply it. A lot of places might not, especially if they're more of a general store, but if you get it from like a vintage repair shop, I do recommend that. That way you can at least know that the instrument's covered over time, whether it's through like homeowners or anything like that, that does help too. But yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say about that, what you can do with them. There's a bunch of different ones that you can get as well, and I do recommend looking to your options as far as that goes. I've heard of people going and just turning them into like lamps and whatnot. My mom one time got my dad like one of those metal clarinets and everything. You couldn't play it or anything like that, but she ended up using it like a hobby thing and just made it into this cool lamp. It was really neat, and that's something you could do too. I mean, there's tons of stuff you can do with those old instruments, but I do recommend that if it's something where you want to play them again, just be careful just getting them fixed up and everything like that, the cost entry, because if it's more of a sentimental repair and to play it, that's one thing, but if it's really just to play an instrument and you just happen to have an instrument, I do recommend looking through those options as far as repairs, maybe getting a more modern instrument, using that as a trade-in, all those things before just overhauling an old instrument that might not be worth it. But hey, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Last week we just did a video on the 2 of my favorite sopranos. If you want to check that out, those were fantastic. But hey, thank you so much for watching. Get in those comments and have a wonderful day.